I first noticed it on a Wednesday night. The phone rang, a piercing shriek in the dead of night, louder than it should have been. My apartment was eerily silent, apart from the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional distant honk from the LA streets. That was the thing about this city. It never slept, and neither, it seemed, could I. I stared at the phone for what felt like an eternity before finally picking it up. Silence. Hello? My voice trembled more than I wanted it to. Nothing. Just the faint hiss of static. Like someone was there, waiting, listening. I hung up, my heart racing. It had to be a prank call, right? LA was crawling with weirdos. I'd heard about it on the news, the string of killings. Women found in their homes, beaten, stabbed, strangled, mutilated. The thought made me shudder. They called him the Night Stalker. A name that clung to the air, a name you whispered to avoid drawing attention, as if invoking it might make him appear. Shaking the thought away, I returned to bed, but sleep never came. I kept picturing his face, grinning, wide-eyed, a dark shadow lurking just outside my window. 2 days later, it happened again. This time I wasn't asleep. The phone rang at exactly 12:17 a.m., and I knew, whoever was on the other end wasn't playing games. I answered without hesitation. "You're next." The voice was low, raspy, and dripping with malice. My stomach dropped and my skin prickled with icy fear. I slammed the receiver down, but I knew. This wasn't just some sick joke. Someone was watching me. I tried to calm down, told myself it couldn't be real. The Night Stalker wouldn't call. That wasn't his MO. He slipped into houses undetected. Struck like a ghost in the night. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The next day, the city was in a frenzy. Another body had been found. Same story. A woman alone, murdered in her own home. But what got me was the detail that wasn't making the headlines. The one whispered about in hushed tones. She'd gotten a call. Just like me, I didn't tell anyone. I mean, what was there to say? I couldn't go to the cops. What would they do? I was just some paranoid woman in a city drowning in fear. But as the days dragged on, the phone calls kept coming. Every night. Always at the same time. Always the same voice. Always the same chilling words. "You're next." I tried changing my number. No luck. The calls kept finding me. It was as if he was inside my head, inside my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow, every darkened corner, every stranger on the street knew something I didn't. One night, I bolted all the doors, locked all the windows, drew the curtains tight, and sat by the phone, staring at it. Waiting? 12:17 a.m. The phone rang. I couldn't breathe. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to pretend for just a moment that this wasn't happening, but I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. Slowly, I lifted the phone to my ear. "I'm inside." The voice was different this time. More excited. More present. My blood turned to ice. I felt a scream building in my throat, but it died before it could escape. I dropped the phone and ran to the front door, but I knew it was too late. The smell hit me first. Something rank, metallic, blood. And then, as I turned the corner into the living room, I saw it. On the floor, scrawled in dark, glistening letters, was a message. "You should have answered sooner." The window was wide open, and the phone began to ring again. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I sat there, curled up in the corner of the room, watching the phone vibrate as it screamed its mechanical ring into the silence. It stopped, but I knew it would start again. He was toying with me, like a predator playing with its prey before the final strike. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching a kitchen knife with trembling hands, eyes darting from window to door to window, waiting for something, anything to happen. The message was still on the floor, the thick, wet letters spelling out my doom. "You should have answered sooner." I wanted to clean it up, but my body was frozen in place, locked in a state of terror. When morning light finally seeped through the curtains, I snapped out of my trance and called the police. My voice sounded foreign to me, shaky, like I wasn't even sure if the words coming out were real. They came within the hour. 2 uniformed officers knocked on the door, their presence oddly comforting. One of them, a stocky man with tired eyes, asked the questions while his partner searched the apartment. "When did this happen? What time exactly?" I told him everything. The calls. The messages. The voice on the other end. His expression darkened as I spoke. When his partner returned, shaking his head, the stocky cop looked at me and sighed. "There's no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence anyone's been here other than you." I blinked. "But the window, it's locked from the inside," he said, cutting me off. "We checked. Are you sure you didn't—" "I didn't imagine this," I snapped. "You think I wrote that?" I pointed to the floor where the blood had been smeared in letters. Both officers turned, exchanging uneasy glances. "What writing?" the stocky cop asked. I felt the room tilt, my vision swimming. The message. The one I'd stared at for hours. The one that had burned itself into my brain. It was gone. The floor was spotless. I swear it was right there, in blood," I stammered. It said, "I'm sure it was scary, ma'am," the cop interrupted, his voice soft now as if speaking to a child. "But there's no blood, no sign of a break-in. If you remember anything else, give us a call." They left soon after, muttering something about stress and overactive imagination. But I knew what I saw. I knew he had been inside. The phone didn't ring again that day. But the silence felt worse, as if the absence of the calls was just a calm before the storm. I couldn't stay there. Not alone. Not anymore. I packed a small bag, just the essentials, and drove across town to stay with a friend. She greeted me with concern as I stumbled into her apartment, pale and frantic. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, handing me a glass of water. "I think I've seen something worse," I muttered, though the words felt hollow. How could I explain what had been happening without sounding insane? For the next few days, I tried to get back to normal. I didn't go back to my apartment, but I felt safer at my friend's place. The phone calls stopped, and I allowed myself to believe for a moment that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then came the night I woke up at 12:17 a.m. sharp. My eyes flicked to the clock, dread crawling up my spine. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I hadn't heard the phone ring, but something else had woken me. A feeling, a cold, suffocating sense of being watched. I turned over in bed, my heart thudding against my ribs, and saw it. A figure standing at the foot of the bed. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the shadowed outline began to move. Slowly. Deliberately? "No," I whispered, but the word barely escaped my lips. My hand fumbled for the lamp on the nightstand, and when I finally managed to switch it on, the room flooded with light. Nothing. No one was there, but something else was. On the wall, scrawled in dark, dripping letters, "I'm still inside." I screamed. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. My friend came running into the room, wide-eyed and panicked. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the wall, but when she looked, her face twisted in confusion. "There's nothing there." I spun back around and my heart dropped. The writing was gone. Completely vanished, as if it had never existed. I tried to explain, but the words tumbled out in incoherent fragments. The look on her face said it all. She didn't believe me. How could she? I barely believed it myself. That night, I left. I drove aimlessly through the city, eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see him there, lurking in the back seat, grinning. By the time I pulled into a random parking lot somewhere on the outskirts of town, I was shaking uncontrollably. I stayed in the car, hands gripping the wheel, headlights off, engine running. It was 12:17 a.m. when the phone rang again. I don't remember answering the phone. One moment, I was staring at the screen as it lit up in the darkness, my mind screaming, "Don't pick it up." The next, the cold plastic of the receiver was pressed against my ear, and the familiar voice slithered through the line. "I'm closer than you think." I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my throat tight with terror. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. The parking lot was empty, my car the only one under the flickering streetlight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was out there, lurking just beyond the shadows, watching me. I locked the doors, my fingers trembling. For a while, nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than the call. The night felt too still, too heavy, like the air itself was suffocating me. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring into the black void beyond the windshield. And then I saw it. A figure. Standing just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight. Too far to make out any features, but close enough that I knew he was staring right at me. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone. I tried to tell myself I hadn't seen anything, that it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. The Night Stalker was real, and he was hunting me. I needed to get out of there. Fast. My hands fumbled for the ignition, and the engine roared to life. As I pulled out of the lot, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, grinning, his eyes gleaming with malice. But the road was empty. I drove aimlessly, the city a blur of neon lights and darkened streets. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to be anywhere but there. My mind was racing, every shadow on the sidewalk, every silhouette of a pedestrian sending a jolt of fear through my body. After what felt like hours, I found myself parked outside my apartment. I hadn't intended to come back here, but my hands had driven on autopilot. The building loomed before me, dark and silent. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the car, to turn around and drive far away, but something was pulling me inside. Some morbid curiosity, or maybe a desperate need to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. The street was quiet, too quiet. The silence felt unnatural, oppressive. I reached for my keys, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the front door and slipped inside. The apartment was just as I had left it, small, cluttered, the faint smell of stale air lingering. But something was off. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the walls were closing in around me. I stood in the doorway, listening, my heart racing. Nothing. The silence was deafening. I took a step inside, my footfalls unnaturally loud in the stillness. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The oppressive weight in the air, the creeping sensation of being watched. It was back, stronger than before. I flipped the light switch. The bulb exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. My heart leaped into my throat. I stood frozen, my eyes wide, struggling to adjust to the dim light filtering in from the street outside. The shadows seemed to move, creeping along the walls, twisting into unnatural shapes. Then I heard it, a soft creak from the bedroom. I wasn't alone. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The sound came again, louder this time. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something or someone moving inside. I gripped the knife I'd taken from my car. My only defense. My only hope. Slowly, cautiously, I moved down the hallway, each step sending a fresh wave of terror through my body. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkness beyond. My breath hitched in my throat. I reached for the door, pushing it open. Empty. The room was empty. But on the bed there was something. A small object placed carefully in the center of the mattress, as if it had been waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped closer, dread twisting in my gut. It was my phone, and it was ringing. I stared at it, paralyzed. It shouldn't have been there. I'd left it in the car. But there it was, vibrating softly, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Against every instinct, I reached for the phone. My hand shook as I lifted it, the soft vibration humming through my fingertips. The screen flickered with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. But deep down, I knew I had to answer. I had to face whatever nightmare was waiting for me on the other end. With a shaky breath, I pressed answer and brought the phone to my ear. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven. Then the voice came. "I'm in the house." The words were whispered, barely audible, but they sent a cold shiver down my spine. My blood ran cold, and I dropped the phone like it was burning me. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the weight of impending doom. I backed away from the bed, my eyes darting around the room, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He was here, in the house. I needed to get out, now. I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut in front of me, as if some unseen force had yanked it from my grasp. I stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. A creak came from behind me. I spun around, the knife held out in front of me like a shield. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could almost feel his breath on the back of my neck, his presence lingering just out of sight. I backed into the living room, my heart racing, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Then I saw it, on the wall, scrawled in thick red letters that hadn't been there moments before. "I told you I was inside." The room tilted, my vision blurring as panic set in. I wasn't losing my mind. He was here, somewhere, watching me. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. And that's when I saw him. Standing in the corner, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, lean, his face obscured by darkness. But his eyes, they gleamed in the light, wide and wild, full of something I couldn't quite place. Something unhinged. I screamed and lunged forward, the knife in my hand slicing through the air. But he was fast. Too fast. He dodged to the side, moving with an unnatural speed, and before I could react, he was behind me. His hand clamped down on my wrist, forcing the knife from my grip. I struggled, kicking, thrashing, but he was too strong. His grip tightened, and I could feel his breath on the back of my neck as he whispered in my ear, his voice low and rasping. "You should have listened." I was thrown to the floor with a violent force, the breath knocked out of me. My vision swam, my body weak and trembling. I tried to get up, to crawl away, but he was there, looming over me like a dark shadow, his face still hidden in the gloom. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The front door creaked open, the cool night air rushing in. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest, and bolted for the door. I didn't look back, I couldn't. The terror of what had just happened was too overwhelming, too real. I ran out into the street, barefoot and shaking, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The city was alive around me, cars honking, people walking, oblivious to the nightmare I had just escaped. But as I looked back at my apartment, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. And there in the doorway was the figure. Watching. Waiting? The phone in my hand vibrated again. I looked down and the screen flashed with the same unknown number. My heart raced and I knew the nightmare wasn't over. As I stared at the phone, a text popped up on the screen, the words making my blood run cold. "I'll see you soon." I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the phone screen, the words glowing like some dark omen. "I'll see you soon." But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the fear, but I had had enough. I wasn't going to let this sick game continue. I wasn't going to be his victim any longer. My body shook with adrenaline, and instead of running like I had done so many times before, I turned back toward the apartment. It was time to end this. I walked through the front door, my heart pounding, but this time it wasn't just fear, it was determination. The apartment was eerily still, as if waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with tension, but I could feel it. I wasn't the same terrified woman from before. Something had changed. I scanned the room, searching for him, for the figure that had haunted me for weeks. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I marched forward past the living room, toward the hallway where I knew he was waiting. And there he was. Standing at the end of the hall, his face hidden by the darkness, his posture eerily calm. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence thick and suffocating. But then, slowly, he stepped forward, his face emerging from the shadows. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had terrorized me, yes. But in that moment, as his wild eyes met mine, I realized something important. He was nothing without my fear. The power he held over me, the horror I had lived through, it was only because I had let him. I had allowed myself to be controlled by terror, but now that fear was gone. "Come on," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "Let's finish this." He hesitated, clearly not expecting this reaction. His eyes darted around, confused, as if trying to figure out why I wasn't cowering, why I wasn't running. I stepped closer, my gaze never leaving his. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." He blinked, his expression shifting from menacing to uncertain. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't know what to do. Without the fear to feed on, without my panic to fuel his twisted game, he was just a man, ordinary, powerless. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He turned and ran. It was almost pathetic watching him stumble toward the door, his confident facade crumbling before my eyes. I followed him, not rushing, just walking step by step as he fled out into the street. He glanced back, panic now filling his eyes as he saw I wasn't stopping. For the first time, he was the one afraid. In a strange way, it felt empowering. The fear that had gripped me for so long was gone, replaced by a calm resolve. I wasn't going to let him control my life anymore. I wasn't going to be his victim. I watched as he disappeared into the night, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he was nothing more than a shadow lost in the city. The weight that had been pressing down on me lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. I walked back into my apartment, shutting the door behind me. The air felt different now, lighter, safer. I picked up the phone from where I had dropped it on the floor earlier and held it in my hand. It didn't scare me anymore. The calls, the threats, they were over. I sank down onto the couch, a strange sense of peace washing over me. The nightmare was over, but more importantly, I had survived. I had faced my fear, looked the monster in the eye, and won. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. No phone calls, no haunting shadows, just the quiet hum of the city outside. When I woke up the next morning, the sun streaming through the window felt like a new beginning. As I got up and made coffee, I glanced at my phone. No missed calls, no messages, just quiet. And then, as I sat down to enjoy my morning, my phone vibrated. For a split second, my heart skipped a beat, the old fear creeping back, but I shook it off. I picked it up, and this time it wasn't a threat. It wasn't him. It was a text from a friend. "Are you okay? The news says they caught him." I blinked, feeling a wave of disbelief. I quickly flipped on the TV, my heart racing, not with fear, but with hope. The local news anchor's voice filled the room. "Police have arrested a suspect in connection with the recent string of murders linked to the Night Stalker. The man was apprehended late last night after a witness reported seeing him fleeing from an apartment complex. They had caught him. The nightmare was truly over." I stared at the screen, my heart swelling with relief. The monster was gone. The man who had terrorized me, who had stalked me, was finally behind bars. And I was free. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I sipped my coffee. The sun shone a little brighter that day.